Today, when I logged on social media, the first post on my timeline said, "Mark my words, this is the first shot that begins the Civil War." Is that the timeline that you want to step into? Is that a trajectory that you feel comfortable with? The cultural tensions that we're currently witnessing are the same concerning societal trends that we address in our new book, The Personality Color Matrix, including how enmity and entitlement have corrupted our discourse, causing us to stray from our centers into polarized extremes. In today's video, we'll use the powerful framework of the Personality Color Matrix to understand what's really happening beneath the surface of political and cultural conflict. My goal with this video is to provide clarity and help us remember, literally come back together, and recognize that despite our political and cultural differences, we are one nation under God. We are humankind, and that kindness defines us. Today, I want to address the national conversation that we're currently having, if you can call it a conversation. Currently, it feels a little bit more like a screaming match. But in the days following the tragic assassination of Charlie Kirk, we have witnessed dramatically different online reactions, from genuine grief and calls for unity and a revival of faith that can best be described as the center of humanity, to disturbing and gleeful celebrations of death and a knee-jerk politicization of violence that can only be described as the extreme. Now, this only happens when those color personality tendencies become disconnected from the goodness of their divine center. Love, unity. This is what constitutes the center. It's the source from which all colors flow and to which they must return if we hope to heal the extreme division in our world. I want to use this opportunity to examine Charlie Kirk's complex personality and the reactions to his passing through the lenses of the Personality Color Matrix technology. We'll discover how the same centered personality tendencies at their best can build movements and inspire positive change. But in their extremes, these same tendencies at their worst can justify and delight in violence and assassination. This isn't just about understanding a tragedy. It's about recognizing the choice that each of us faces between returning to our centered love-based values or allowing extremism to destroy connection and our common humanity. Kirk's assassination represents more than the loss of a controversial political figure. It serves as a mirror, reflecting the extreme polarization that has infected every corner of American discourse. It's the latest escalation in a cycle of political violence that has been building for decades. Today, political opponents are routinely described as enemies of democracy, threats to the republic, and existential dangers to vulnerable communities. Politicians and activists regularly receive death threats, and several high-profile figures have recently been targeted. To understand how we reached this critical juncture and why some people chose to respond to Kirk's death with indifference, sarcasm, insensitivity, and even glee, we must first grasp the fundamental divide that's fueling the division in our country, which comes down to a clash between two complementary value systems that also have centered and extreme characteristics. In the personality color matrix technology, we refer to these complementary value systems as oriented around strength and those oriented around warmth. Now, I believe that it is imperative to understand how an individual's frame of reference can differ depending on if they're more influenced by strength values or warmth values. The distinction offers a foundational understanding of how these differing perspectives can lead to conflict and enmity, so that we can recognize two key points that are essential to our society's communal healing. The first lesson is that perspective is subjective. The way that we each individually see the world is not the way that others perceive it. And that's just a fact of reality. These differing perspectives are actually gifts because they provide us with an opportunity to learn and grow our understanding. The second key point is that rather than simply tolerating, ignoring, or attempting to destroy or silence contrary or complementary worldviews, we must take the opportunity to find value and wisdom in centered differing perspectives that we're otherwise inclined to reject. This is rarely a comfortable process, but it is imperative for emotional and intellectual growth. And it's fundamental to demonstrating respect for differing beliefs. Having that mutual respect that allows us to experience civil discourse is essential to saving our nation from the out-of-control tailspin that we are currently in that is leading towards more division and destruction. Let's begin this analysis by understanding values that are oriented around strength. Charlie Kirk exemplified strength-rooted values. Individuals who value strength rely primarily on their heads as opposed to their hearts when it comes to making decisions. They value tradition, effort, productivity, achievement, and results that they believe create stability in society. That's what they seek above all else. They prefer to reason with logic. Therefore, thinkers who draw their values from strength are more practical or realistic in their focus. In the center, strength values honor, stability, respect, integrity, meritocracy, intelligence, and reliability. These are their mainstays. And it's evident in Charlie Kirk's choices and beliefs that he greatly revered centered strength qualities. However, in the extreme, strength can become anything but honorable. Extreme strength can harden and become rigid, and this rigidity offers no invitation for discourse. It shuts people down. In fact, extreme strength, like extreme warmth, they both lead to censorship, which is why it should be no surprise now that the pendulum of cancel culture is swinging to the other side. At its worst, extreme strength morphs into a drive for absolute power and a desire to silence any differing opinions and perspectives. When the extreme version of strength takes over, it leads individuals to become aggressive, arrogant, demeaning, and narcissistic, just operating from an assumption that they are right and everyone who doesn't agree with them is wrong, stupid, or simply needs to be forced back into line. And so obviously this leads to oppression. This leads to unnecessary cruelty and domination and repressive attitudes that lean on tradition as a way of enforcing compliance. Our aversion to extreme strength often spills over into how we view centered strength. Because centered strength is necessary and important. It's critical for the growth and success of individuals and societies. But at the same time, those who value warmth in the extreme can show little tolerance for any kind of strength. They associate it with the rigidity and a lack of inclusiveness that exemplifies extreme strength. Individuals guided by centered warmth values rely more on their hearts in making decisions. They value people, relationships, possibilities, and ideals rather than limitations. And they yearn for unrestricted freedom and flexibility to grow. They naturally prioritize kindness, collaboration, care, inclusion, empathy, fairness, and sympathy above all else. They stand for what they consider to be the underdog, those with limited power and a stifled voice. And they focus on what can be changed or revolutionized because they feel the current state of affairs is greatly lacking in fairness. They want people to like them, and they feel safe when they're surrounded by other warmth-influenced individuals. They're drawn to words like equality and unity. They dream of building a utopic society where abuse and oppression, however they might define abuse and oppression, are dismantled. The motivation of this hopeful and what they believe to be righteous destruction can cause warmth to ultimately move into an extreme version of itself. They can declare war against perceived injustice, transforming into the same oppressive, fundamentalist force that they despise. This can result in self-deceiving, overprotective actions that enable victimhood, or it can appear as impulsive, combative, and overly emotional reactions driven by a desperate need for fairness, appreciation, or attention. In many ways, the difference between strength and warmth exemplifies the difference between traditional conservative and progressive liberal values. Now, that insight is crucial to understanding how we reached this point where individuals with extreme opposing political or cultural beliefs cannot tolerate being in a room with someone who disagrees with their worldview. It also explains why some have mourned this tragedy and responded with calls for respect. Those are the centered perspectives, while others have mocked or celebrated it. And that's those that are lost in their extremes. From this base understanding, let's move on to examining who Charlie Kirk was and what he represented in American society. While those who oppose his strength values saw Kirk as undeniably polarizing, building his career on challenging progressive orthodoxies through confrontational debate and dialogue, others saw him as a beacon of integrity and hope. From a perspective of the personality color matrix, his rhetorical style exemplified strong red and blue tendencies, the desire to debate with what he deemed to be logic, irrefutable facts, common sense, and a brain that worked like an encyclopedia that complemented his unwavering certainty in his own intellect. Those who ardently opposed him defined his unshakable and immovable stance as extreme. They saw him as an intellectual bully. But there was another color that was crucial from the warmth side of the spectrum that defined who Charlie Kirk was and also explains why he was killed. That color is green. To fully comprehend this tragedy and the spectrum of reactions it provoked, we have to examine what the personality color matrix tells us about green personality tendencies in both their centered, life-giving form and their extreme, destructive manifestation. In its centered form, green represents the visionary aspect of human nature, the part that can see beyond present circumstances and imagine a better world. They are guided by a moral compass that points toward genuine prosperity for all. Centered green personality values include vision, purpose, and the ability to see future possibilities and work toward meaningful change. They also possess compassion, a desire for inclusion, and a genuine care for the vulnerable. This all combines to create a desire for systems that work for everyone, They prioritize justice and fairness, commitment to equality while respecting individual dignity and rights. They have a passion for meaning making, which is the drive to connect actions to larger purposes beyond material success. They have a naturally collaborative spirit. They have a deep sense of understanding that lasting change requires building coalitions across differences. However, when green values reach their extremes, they become unrecognizable from their centered origins through several destructive patterns. It morphs into rigidity, extremism, and dogmatism. Individuals behaving out of their extreme green personality tendencies can develop absolute certainty about complex moral and social issues, becoming unwilling to consider alternate perspectives, and they believe that any and all dissenting views should be silenced rather than engaged. This represents a complete departure from centered green's openness to dialogue and nuanced understanding. It replaces the healthy desire for progress with an inflexible demand for ideological conformity. These individuals create ideological purity tests, where anyone failing to conform to exact moral specifications is deemed an enemy of justice itself. What begins as centered green's legitimate concern for fairness and equality transfers into rigid orthodoxy that excludes rather than includes, turning that beautiful green value of fighting for the oppressed into a weapon that oppresses anyone who questions their methods. This hypocrisy defines green extremes, and it happens on both sides of the political and cultural debate. You see, both strength and warmth in their extreme become angry, distorted, and destructive versions of their powerful, positive-centered truths. And you can bet that I'm going to make a video in the future that talks about the dangers of extreme strength. But extreme warmth is subtle in how treacherous it can be, because it poses as being a champion for the underdog, for the oppressed. Many of Kirk's most ardent critics operated primarily from warmth values in their extreme. And before we proceed any further, I think it's important to watch this clip and understand how extreme warmth shows up when it perceives strength to be extreme strength, and how it begins to actually make the exact same mistakes that extreme strength makes in terms of silencing opposition and being intensely oppressive and disrespectful. And ultimately, it becomes exactly what it seeks to oppose. It becomes hateful, violent, and exclusionary. Now, before we watch this clip, I just want to set the stage with some context here. This was recorded a couple of days ago at Texas Tech University. There were individuals that were holding a vigil for Charlie Kirk in the free speech designated area of the campus. And I think that that's an important key to point out here as we discuss what goes down. But there was an 18-year-old student that ended up interrupting the vigil and making a mockery of Charlie Kirk's memory.
Yo, homie dead! Yo, homie dead! He got shot in the head! Yo, homie dead!
Evil is real, people, and it kind of looks like that. Evil. Evil. Murder is bad. She is evil.
Why are you being so
Why are you
hateful?
so hateful? Why are you so hateful? Why are you so hateful? Yeah.
Hey, can somebody tell her to back up?
Can you
please?
not
She's
put the camera in my face?
I'm sitting here. You walked up to me.
Okay, well, I can
I don't
do
want
this
this.
too.
I said rest in peace.
Okay, and I can do
Just
this
leave it
too.
alone. Please don't come after
Ma'am,
me.
you've been
I want to be left alone.
I'm not emotional, ma'am. Don't tell me what I am and what I'm not. You can get out of my face, because I could tell you what you are, but you won't like it.
You're being aggressive. You're being aggressive.
I'm not being aggressive. My voice is
You are
very
being
calm. You're calling me
aggressive.
aggressive because I'm a black woman.
Not at all.
You are. We're not.
The way that extreme green twists itself into a justification and celebration of murder was clearly visible in the clip that we just watched. What happened at Texas Tech wasn't just a spontaneous act of disrespect. It was the inevitable result of a cultural trajectory that's been brewing for years. It was a case study in what happens when the impulse to protect justice and fairness gets hijacked by extremes, specifically rage, tribalism, and self-deception. When the student mocked Charlie Kirk's death at the campus vigil, it wasn't merely about him or even about the people grieving him. It was about something much bigger, an ideology that had hardened into an identity forged in opposition, where every interaction is framed as a battle between the oppressed and the oppressors, between morally pure and the morally corrupt. Rather than recognizing his death as a human tragedy while still opposing his ideas, this individual celebrated his killing as a victory for justice or a fair deserved outcome. The ultimate tragedy of extreme green personality tendencies is that it transforms compassionate people into the very thing that they initially opposed, which is individuals that are capable of cruelty, hatred, dehumanization, and assault. In the name of fighting hatred, they become hateful. In the name of opposing dehumanization, they dehumanize others. In the name of protecting the vulnerable, they create new categories of acceptable victims. This kind of behavior comes from the extreme green tendency to confirm one's biases. The student didn't walk into that vigil seeking dialogue. She walked in to reinforce a worldview where the other side, represented here by mourners of a prominent conservative figure, was the enemy. Her goal wasn't to understand strength, but to retaliate against what she perceived to be extreme strength. And in her mind, retaliation was justified, even righteous, because those that she was targeting were complicit in larger systems of oppression in her eyes. And in that moment, the death of Charlie Kirk wasn't a tragedy. It was a symbolic victory. Her behavior, shocking as it was to some, was perfectly logical within the moral framework that she adopted. Retribution for perceived harm. The student likely saw herself not as a disruptive agitator, but as a moral warrior. In her mind, she wasn't desecrating a moment of mourning. She was confronting a symbol of oppression. But that's how extreme warmth works. It tells itself that cruelty is justified if it's in the name of justice. It pretends that love for the oppressed gives one license to hate the perceived oppressor. The core impulse of protecting the vulnerable becomes disfigured by rage, and the result is not healing, it's harm. When warmth enters that extreme, the compassion gets replaced by contempt. The empathy turns into hostility. A heart-centered drive to support the marginalized transforms and gets twisted into open war against those perceived as threats. And tragically, in the process, the person in extreme warmth becomes the very thing that they despise, the oppressor. Just as they condemn cruelty, they embody it, often with the same righteous fervor. This is the paradox of radicalized warmth. It thinks it's acting out of love, but it's actually operating from fear, anger, and a desperate need for moral certainty. That's why it becomes so rigid. It can't tolerate contradiction. This kind of moral absolutism expects prejudice at every turn. It's trained to assume that those who disagree must be bigots, racist, or fascists. And this explains why the student was quick to accuse her opponents of attributing her aggression to her racial and gender identity. Once that assumption takes root, the rules of decency no longer apply. There's no longer a need to engage respectfully or even honestly. The irony, of course, is that to sustain this behavior, one has to consistently see themselves as a victim, even in moments of aggression. The mindset requires a sense of perpetual persecution, which then justifies any act, no matter how cruel or divisive, as a form of justified resistance. That's why this kind of activism is so deeply tribal. It thrives on division. It needs enemies. It needs conflict. It doesn't seek to persuade. It seeks to win and humiliate. The extreme green identity is locked in a cycle of blame because it constantly sees injustice, and often real injustice. But it begins to organize its entire worldview around it. Rather than seeking systemic healing, it seeks retribution. And so intolerance becomes a method to fight intolerance. Disrespect becomes a weapon against insensitivity. And mockery becomes a form of protest. The student wasn't interested in shared values. She was there to violate and desecrate what the other side held sacred because she believed they had already desecrated what she believed in. It wasn't about building a better world. It was about tearing down the perceived architects of the current one. When green strays from its center, it no longer sees the big picture. It sees only enemies. And in doing so, it becomes blind to its own extremism. Let this be a cautionary tale of what happens when we start perceiving centered strength as extreme strength, or vice versa, centered warmth as extreme warmth, because this happens on both sides of the political spectrum. The individual in the MAGA hat didn't necessarily do himself any favors by labeling her as evil, and then pointing the camera phone in somebody's face and recording them. The guaranteed way to know whether or not you're operating in your center or your extreme in 2025 is whether or not you are currently filming another individual, right? Recording the altercation. Because what are you doing? You're building a case against them in order to incriminate them. A lot of what she's saying that we've seen in these clips, yes, it's distasteful, but it is still considered free speech. But part of what ends up happening in the mindset of extreme warmth is a disregard for consequences. My free expression matters more than your feelings. But when you get to the point where you are saying that my feelings matter more than your safety, that cannot be tolerated. Now, it's hard to argue that flipping somebody's hat back is the same as physically attacking them, but you get to the point where you're putting your hands on another person because of the perception that they are your enemy. Your free speech is protected, and this was a zone of the campus that was specifically dedicated to that. But it doesn't make you immune from consequence. The consequence here, in this case, is being expelled from the university. The fact that now all of these people are making YouTube videos that are breaking down and analyzing your extreme behavior. The deeper tragedy is that the very values that extreme green and extreme warmth claim to defend, human dignity, equality, compassion, are violated in the name of defending them. Instead of modeling a better world, we mirror the worst parts of the one that we want to change. And in that moment driven by bitterness, not love, we cease to be the defenders of the marginalized and become desecrators of grief. That's the cost of radicalized warmth. It doesn't just burn the enemy. It scorches the very ideals that it promises to protect. That's what makes extreme warmth so dangerous. Because even if the behavior was legally questionable or ethically indefensible, to those inside the ideological framework, it was heroic. To them, it wasn't an act of cruelty, it was an act of justice. But that kind of logic doesn't lead anywhere good. It replaces community with combat, and it turns campuses into battlegrounds. It takes legitimate grievances and converts them into emotional weapons. And once that line is crossed, where hatred becomes a tool of virtue and grief becomes something to be mocked, we're no longer debating policies or principles. We're just dehumanizing each other because we insist on not seeing the center, but only the extreme of our perceived opposition. But here's the good news, right? We all have the choice that comes with the awareness. When we become aware that we are operating out of our extremes, there's a moment where we have the power, because we can always take a step back and choose the center. We can not only take accountability and choose to return to our own center, but we can choose to see the center in those that we perceive as our opponents or as our enemies. We can find the value and the wisdom that we so desperately need, because strength and warmth are not meant to live in perpetual opposition. They're meant to learn from each other. They're meant to help each other grow, even if that process of growth is deeply uncomfortable. As Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. profoundly stated, power without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and anemic. That's to say that although these two sides do not always see eye to eye, the greatest lesson that they can learn is from each other. Strength understands how to do hard things by developing discipline, resilience, and accountability. But strength struggles with grace, empathy, and feelings. In contrast, warmth understands feelings, empathy, and sympathy, but struggles with developing discipline, logical and strategic planning, and taking accountability. Our ability to thrive, individually and collectively, relies on integrating both value systems. But that's really difficult when they keep perceiving and defining each other exclusively according to their extremes. This is the opportunity that we have. And it comes with our choice. Do you choose the center, or do you choose the extreme? And I'll tell you, the fate of our country depends on us as individuals, and then thus collectively choosing that center. If you're committed to choosing the center, go ahead and write that in the comments below. Say, I choose the center, and share this video with someone that needs to hear it. It could be your best friend. It could be your worst enemy. We all have to integrate this message. We all have to take the individual action in this time where we are at this turning point to choose accountability and grace over perpetual blame and division. Until we see each other again, stay colorful.